Good morning, I'm Chuck Fluharty. I am with the Rural Policy Research Institute at the University of Missouri. A wonderful opening challenge to this community and a really inspiring program last night. For those of you that missed it, I would say we had young Nebraskans really living out what Wendell Berry talked about last week at his Jefferson lecture in D.C. on affection for place, community, and future, and it was very inspiring. I'd be remiss if I didn't make one comment in starting here, and I'd like to do that to begin the session. We've already had an expression of appreciation to Mark and to Sam and to the phenomenal team that's doing the logistical work, but I want to take a minute to commend President Milliken and Vice Chancellor Green. I believe I'll be the only person up here that isn't related to the University of Nebraska. And for those of you that have worked in these vineyards many years, and 500 of our closest colleagues are here, all of whom have, there's many of us who are pretty accustomed to rural lip service. And we're also accustomed to small, tactical, incremental steps that are clothed in transformational language. But seldom in our nation do we have a major research institution at its highest leadership level taking this challenge frontally. And that is occurring here in the next 2 days, and I think it will move forward from here. It took both courage and commitment, and it bodes well for your state. I believe it bodes well for rural people all over the nation. I'd just like to ask us right now to express our appreciation as a community of concern to the leadership of the University of Nebraska system for what they're undertaking. And now we move to the action phase of the agenda, and we have three visionary academic and social entrepreneurs. Let me introduce them briefly, and then we'll move right into the program. To my immediate left is Jay Kiesling, who is the Hubbard Howe Jr. Distinguished Professor of Biochemical Engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. He also serves as Director of the Physical Biosciences Division of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and Synthetic Biology Engineering Research Center, and as CEO of Joint Bioenergy Institute. Jay is a native Nebraskan. He received the inaugural Biotech Humanitarian Award from the Biotechnology Industry Organization in 2009 for his work in creating a synthetic product to move an anti-malarial drug to the poor. And his deeper bio, as with his colleagues, is in your program. Second is Shane Ferrier, who is a professor here in the Mechanical Engineering Department, doing research on space robotics, surgical robotics, sensors. He started 2 organizations in the private sector. He also teaches creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship within his pedagogy. He holds degrees in mechanical engineering from UNL and MIT. He's a native Nebraskan also, and grew up in a small central Nebraska town, Ravenna. Our third panelist is Fred Luthens, who is the University and George Holmes Distinguished Professor of Management here at UNL. Before coming to Nebraska in the late 60s, he served as an officer in the United States Army and taught leadership at West Point. He currently is chair of the Master Research Council at HumanX Ventures and has been actively doing research, teaching, and consulting in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, especially China, for over 30 years. He is a past president of the Academy of Management, and his current focus is on what he terms positive organizational behavior and psychological capital. Let's give a welcome to our panelists today. We're now initiating the discussion of how this institution and the other institutions with which it interacts begins to think about the challenge that was laid to us by this phenomenal keynote at the start. How do we move from discipline to transdiscipline? How do we move from campus to multi-institution? And how do we move from multi-institution to stakeholder engagement? So I'd like to begin by just raising the question for the three panelists, and it would be basically this. The Rural Futures Institute is designed to address those issues, to really move what our speaker talked about beyond embracing change to initiating change. What would the three of you recommend very quickly this community of concern should do to move the University of Nebraska and its collaborating institutions in that direction? And let's go just down the line if we could. Jay, want to start?
Sure. So I think one of the greatest agents for change is either to have an enormous problem or to have a huge disruption. And there are a lot of problems that we all face. Society as a whole faces huge problems in energy and food and water, and I think these can be one of the greatest ways to motivate collaborations. Of course, to back that up, you need the funding to be able to work on those big problems, and you need dedicated people who are really dedicated to the cause and want to see the problem solved.
Okay. Shane?
Let me suggest something that I try to teach when I try to teach engineers about being creative. There's a concept from a book called Little Bets, and it was sort of talked about this morning in the smallest realizable step. I think we as a community need to find a way to seed small projects that could lead to big wins. And as we heard this morning, it's very difficult to figure out which ones of these are the ones that are going to be successful. But if you frame your activity in a way that you have many small bets out there and you pay attention for what can become big wins, I think that's a great way to move things forward.
Okay, Shane, thanks. Good start. Fred?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate being here. I'm kind of a little bit of an outsider over in the College of Business, but my approach is going to be to all of these questions is that I think the questions are as important as the answers. But I think that we have to take, and my whole pitch here is going to be on answering the questions as best I can. That's a hard act to follow, by the way, that we just saw. That was great. I think that my approach is that I have to take my professorial role seriously and say that we have to get into an evidence-based approach to everything that we talk about. So my hopefully going to give you an evidence-based approach, but that is pragmatic. So that's kind of my guiding framework of how the answers to some of these questions will be, is that it's got to be evidence-based, but it also has to be pragmatic. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen.
Okay, thanks. Let's push a bit on that just in terms of the institutional reality. We all know there have been many efforts like this in many places over many eons. Most of us have scars from all of those at some place on our beings. Take the education sector and the teaching, research, and outreach function of a land-grant system. Take that out a decade, if you would, in your field. What do you see happening? This is a monumental change moment, as Jay indicated. Take us out 10 years. What do you see? What is the change that will occur in the sector that might drive this Rural Futures Initiative toward either a greater hope or a greater challenge in your area of endeavor? And let's spend a little time on that. What is your future vision for 10 years in the area in which you do this phenomenal work? Jay, would you want to start there?
So I do my research largely in the biology sector, in biotechnology. I engineer microbes to produce chemicals, drugs, or fuels. Biology has been a cottage industry. So you have a lot of individual researchers working in their individual laboratories with a group of graduate students or postdocs working around them. They tend to work on basic science problems. And I think what we're seeing in the field is that we need to work as teams now, that the problems are so big that biology is going to start to mirror big physics, where you have these huge research groups that are not just in a single institution, but all over the world working together on a big problem. And that presents new challenges. How do you incentivize people? How do you give them credit for the work they contributed to that? And I think if you look at all of the problems in the world and how people approach them, you come up with the same things. How do you give people credit? How do you incentivize them when they're working in large teams? Because it's a whole new way of doing research, doing science.
Let me push a little on that. How do you see that happening? Let's go out 8 or 10 years. What's it going to be like in your work?
Well, we start to see bits of that coming on right now. You see a lot of funding agencies moving to this mode of working with funding large teams of people. And these can be real challenges. You have to get somebody who's really invested in it at the top, who's willing to put their career on the line in order to see that research come to fruition. And you have to have some people be willing to take big risks. And so, I think if we look 10 years out, we're going to see, if things continue to go as they're going, large teams of researchers working on big problems. The one that's closest to my heart right now is turning biomass into biofuels. I think this is a huge opportunity for rural America. We could maybe make the Midwest into the new Mideast if we can produce enough fuel. But it's a huge problem, and it's going to take huge teams of people to solve this.
We'll come back to that in a bit when we talk about stakeholders. Shane, would you address the same question in some detail?
Yeah, I guess I'll speak a little hopefully, but I think the future is very bright. I think the biggest change I would see is, my field is mechanical engineering, and I hope that in 10 years people are wondering why we're called mechanical engineers. The traditional mechanical engineer is about grease and gears and pulleys and belts and those kinds of things. And as I work in surgery robotics, and I have friends who work in biofuels or blood flow, that name mechanical engineering means much less. And it really is less about what department you're in. It's more about what big problem are you tackling and who are you trying to help with your work.
Do you see funding driving this? Do you see institutional leadership? Do you see stakeholders, communities, in firms driving it, all the above?
Yeah,
what?
I don't like to say, I guess I'd go with stakeholders. I don't like to say that funding will drive this. I think, my job as an engineer is to help people. And you go out and you look for big problems to tackle. And you tackle the ones where you can make the most progress and you can help the most people. And I think that's what has to drive our work in the future.
Okay. You think that will be increasing as we move into the decade?
I do.
Okay.
I do. I think at the federal level things are going to change from a funding perspective, and we're going to be driven towards problems that really have an effect on society and really can help people.
Okay. Fred, your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, I think, again, I'm going to try to be the people guy here, people, behavior, and the psychology of all this, because I think obviously technology is driving a lot of all we talk about and all we think about in the future, but we all know in our heart of hearts here that it really gets down to people. Now, the key here is, again, as I started saying, I think it's a matter of evidence-based people stuff, because we're all experts. We're all experts when it comes to people. But I think we've got to get to the point where we're getting some evidence-based approaches. So, for example, in terms of the collaboration that I hear over and over here, I think that is absolutely wonderful. But I think it's also a matter of simply some things, some takeaways here. We is always better than me. We is always better than me, whether that's in our local communities, whether that's in our university, system, whether that's interinstitutional. We is always better than me. Better how? More effective. France just brought out some great points about that kind of statement, but we have all the social psychology supporting that. One of my colleagues at UNO, Ronnie Ryder-Pullman, she's going to be talking at some point in this conference as well. She has a center for collaborative sciences, and I just saw her in the hallway afterwards, and she said, wow, he's doing exactly what we're talking about in terms of the intersection of, the collaboration. And that's, again, I was really happy to hear the kinds of things he was talking about. But it gets down to the people side. And the we is greater than, me, is a kind of a takeaway that we can all have in judging how we do things, because that's pragmatic. And I think that collaboration is so important. My whole field is organizational behavior. I was a management trained guy, a lot of economics, but then I got a little bit into psychology. So where I started my field of organizational behavior was at the intersection of psychology and management. Wow, I never could have done that just by being a management professor. I wouldn't be on the stage here today if I hadn't had that kind of collaboration between disciplines. So I actually have the first textbook that put psychology and management together into this field we call organizational behavior, which by far, right now, is by far the biggest field in all of management, is organizational behavior. But it's psychology and management. And so I think that's an example of where we're going to do. We have to create our own future. We can't let it come to us.
Let me push a little on that in terms of the charge to this conference, because this community of stakeholders, not only in the institution, not only in other university institutions, but across the state, is really being asked a unique question that you're helping to frame right now. And that is, how do we go about a Rural Futures Institute that is real, that does have that small enough to matter and achieve but move dynamic? So let's talk about what adjustments or changes you see from where you sit that universities are going to need to do to advantage what you see is actually happening over the next decade. Let's get very practical. 3 or 4 things that in your work will make a difference. Jay?
I think one is evaluating people based on their work in teams. I think this comes back to your point.
Yep.
A lot of the evaluations that we all go through, whether that be for raises or whatever, is a me kind of thing. And I think it needs to be more about we and what you did for the team. I see this impacting the kind of work I try to do and trying to build teams. I like the idea of the university placing a lot of small bets. I think there's a program at the University of California. It's since dried up because of the University of California budget cuts, but where they actually gave out small grants for PIs at the university to work with companies. And so the companies would throw in part of the money, the university would match that money. Small amounts of money to get research programs going, but it had a huge impact, particularly on the biotech sector. Got a lot of companies started in this area. And then I think the next thing the university can do is help get over this kind of valley of death. You know, a lot of students are very creative. They want to start companies. They want to be innovative. They need mentors to get them beyond that, to see how to build a company, and then beyond that, you know, things like startup space, et cetera, I think can be very helpful. So I think there's a number of things the university can do that will really advance this area.
I'll come back to the rural dimension of this in a moment. Shay, your thoughts, 2 or 3 things that could really matter.
Well, let me push a little on the education side, I guess. That's, again, part of my role as a faculty member. So, you know, a couple common complaints with our education, the way we educate students today is, first of all, there's only one right answer. And if each of you, you know, we all have to fill in box D, and then it gets fed into the machine to be graded because D is the only right answer. And engineers are specifically guilty of grading students on, it's not 4.1, it's 4.0, you know, and that kind of attitude. But if you all think about your own jobs, when was the last problem you tackled that really only had one right answer? It's just non-existent in the world beyond those sheets we fill out with a number 2 pencil. And then the other thing is something Jay said before, is we grade students exactly on what they do and only what they do. And again, think of your job, and when was the last time in your job you did something that only depended on what you did? And that's, again, next to non-existent. So I think we need to mix in some new aspects in our education system. That's what I try to do in this innovation and creativity classes that I teach. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a believer in there's only one right answer in math often, and I did well because I learned to add fractions and multiply fractions in high school very well, and that's very, very important, but there's more to it than that, and there's going to be more to that in the future. I can still multiply fractions, by the way. And then the other thing I try to mix in is the entrepreneurship thing. If I tie back into what I said before, you know, research and basic research is very important, but if we can translate that into a product that helps people, that's where we really can make a big impact. So I think that's something we need to mix more directly into our education system.
Two thoughts. I thought the grant program announcement today was very encouraging and commute to both your comments. Also, I saw some of your students in the back with tape recorders about the fact there's no wrong answer, so they'll get with you later. Fred, your thought on this from the more the behavioral and management side of the equation. What are 2 or 3 things we could do right now?
I think a couple of things. One, you know, a very pragmatic thing from a purely mechanical kind of perspective. We have to make sure we don't create more bureaucracy. That's the big problem. And so we've got to get more toward a horizontal kind of thinking, but also horizontal even structuring, so that we're more networked rather than building more layers and vertical kinds of structure. I'd like to, though, get more of the behavioral side as well, which, again, I said I would do here. And that is another evidence-based takeaway for you. You get what you reward. You get what you reward. That's a very, you know, again, simple, pragmatic, something to take away. I was very pleased to see Vice Chancellor Green come up here and announce 2 initiatives, because you get what you reward. If you want these initiatives to happen, you have to give some, you know, meat to them. So I love those 2, you know, announcements this morning about research grants. I love that. I see Prem Paul sitting here. I mean, he's been by far the best thing that's happened in my 45 years at the university in terms of rewarding, not always with money, by the way, but with just respect and, you know, following up on the research that all of us are trying to do. And he does that in such a personable way that I think it's not just the money, but it's certainly reinforcement. If you don't get reward, you're not going to do it. I love the fact that this initiative is occurring because of the, again, the interaction that's going on. My other pragmatic thing is we have to try to change mindset. And that seems like an impossible task. We've got to move more toward, kind of negativity. Oh, what's wrong with rural America? How can we fix things? No, I'd rather take a positive approach and take what's right with rural America. And of course, we see a lot of that last night, and I love to hear all that, including our governor. I love to hear his positive statements about Nebraska. I think that's wonderful. And, beyond the football team. But the key here is that I think we've got to get into this positive mindset. And guess what? That's possible. We can get into a positive mindset. And the evidence is that if we are thinking positive, that builds out. If we're thinking negative, that caves in. We know that from the basic research on up through teams, organizational level, community level, America level. So that's what I'm, like for example, next week, he said I'm going to China. I'm going to China giving a program called Happy China. As we all know, China is booming, but their well-being is in the tank. And they have a problem over there. So, here's a solution. I give them some answers about building positivity, building some evidence-based approaches to get that mindset going so that they can do something about it. And again, the research says we're about 50% kind of set, but that other 10% of circumstance doesn't matter that much either. What matters, in other words, lottery winners don't, they're not happy very long. On average, 8 months, always exceptions. But the key here is that 40% of who we are is up to us. And that's what we've got to somehow get instilled. And I think we can do that through coursework. I think we can do that on some of the questions you'll get to later.
Okay. Let me push 2 stakeholder communities and stay very practical. One is the rural youth of Nebraska and the broader stakeholder community of rural Nebraska. are there specific ingredients you haven't mentioned? Obviously, resources, reward systems, incenting, and making that very real, not just words. And that's very hard, as we know, in an institutional setting. But are there other ingredients in either our student base, our pedagogy, or reaching out to those phenomenal young Nebraskans that you would recommend this institute think about initiating right now to build more transdisciplinary, cross-campus research, outreach, and teaching? Thoughts for youth and the stakeholders, and biomass was one that's mentioned, but there are many others. Thoughts about all that? Jay?
Be nice to keep Nebraskans in Nebraska. But
how do we do that, Jay?
That's it. I think opportunities are the way to keep them in Nebraska. You know, there's so many positive things about Nebraska and about kind of the life and the way of living. And I happened to grow up on a pig farm, and I scooped a lot of pig manure as a kid. And it was a great lesson for the future, because almost nothing looks like hard work anymore. So maybe more kids scooping hog manure would be good.
The sweet smell of success, right?
Yes, exactly.
Well,
Shane?
let me brag a little bit, I guess. We, in our research group, in the past 4 years, we've had 6 National Science Foundation Fellows, which is an astonishing number, I think, to anyone across the nation would be surprised at that. But the thing I'm most proud of is that 5 of them are small-town Nebraska kids: North Platte, Grand Island, Ravenna, Papillion. We had one oddball from Sioux Falls, which is, I guess, a small town too. But the talent is there, and you know, I would hearken back on a few things. I mean, we're talking about the rural futures, and it's a very interesting question if you look at the research about why cities even exist. You know, the cities have a lot going against them. They're expensive, right? Nobody wants to spend an hour going to work. There's lots of reasons not to live in a city, and we all know those because we love the rural communities so much. There's a lot of advantages. Land's cheap in the rural communities. Why should you build a business in a big city as opposed to a small town? It will be cheaper in a small town, and the talent's there, obviously. But cities have a lot going for them, and it's the proximity to other people. Most people that study this have decided that it's being near, you build a business here because your lawyer is down the street, and you have an accountant here, and you have all these, you're near another business that does similar things, and it's not straightforward explaining why cities exist. And we have to recognize that there's some disadvantages to the rural setting. If we think about what we heard this morning, diversity came up all the time, and I don't want to talk about sort of superficial diversity about skin color or some other things like that, but in terms of conceptual diversity, if I think of Ravenna, everybody went to the same high school in Ravenna and had the same history teacher in Ravenna, so everybody knows the same history in Ravenna, and that can be a challenge. Now, you know, the other thing that comes up with just diversity is density. If you get a lot of diverse people in one place, how they mix is another aspect of that. And I think these are all challenges. These are things that happen well in a city, but not so well in the rural community. So I think we need to look at ways we can increase conceptual diversity. Maybe it's with connections across small communities, and we can increase mixing like these conferences like this, and we can make more connections by doing things like putting out a couple seed grants where we don't think anything will come of it, but we're going to try it. We're not smart enough to figure out which ones will be successful, but we're going to put out a few seed grants and make a few connections. So I think we just need to be very cognizant of the challenges that face rural communities as well as the advantages that rural communities present.
Okay, thanks. Fred?
Yeah, I think for our youth, I think obviously that's where our future is, but I think we have to focus, and actually I was glad again to hear the governor say that we have to focus on jobs. How can we give these young people an opportunity that spells out in a job? And I think one kind of interdisciplinary that everybody's into, engineering, agricultural, East Campus, Business School for sure, are all in that common thread of entrepreneurship. And I think we all understand it's interdisciplinary. And I think the opportunity there is that it is to provide jobs, to keep our youth here, to keep our youth, you know, that they know this is all going to pay off. So I think that I personally make a distinction between innovation, which is great, and we need it, and I love it, and you know, the things that we heard this morning is how to get there, but I'm more interested in how do you make that into a job? How do we do that? And I think that that's where entrepreneurship comes in. There's a distinction between innovation and discovery and commercialization of it. In other words, we need more Steve Jobs than we do. My understanding is that at the National Science Foundation, you know, they have all kinds of ideas sitting on the shelf with no opportunity to commercialize them. That's where the genius has to come in, and you can say that's discovery and you can say that's innovation too. But I think the key here is that it's small jobs, small firms creating the jobs. And that is through entrepreneurship, and that is through interdisciplinary, and that's where, you know, rural America and rural Nebraska can really make a difference, is that there's a job back home. And I'll tell you, my kids, the kids I teach in the university here, they're interested in getting a job. And if there is no job, then that's a problem. So how do we concentrate on jobs?
Okay, there are microphones around the room. We want to move to questions. I want to move into your questions one more time with a practical request. This institute is about transdiscipline, cross-campus, statewide linkages with stakeholders. If you were Ronnie Green and J.B. Milliken, name the one thing you feel you would do in the next 6 months to drive a reality to that agenda. Jay?
Well, I like the idea of the small grants program. I think that's a great thing to do. I think having a list of problems for and making students aware of them so that they can, you know, a lot of time people don't understand what all the problems are, and they can come to some innovative solutions. And the nice thing about getting young people involved in those is they don't have all this bias about what hasn't worked in the past. And so I think just making them aware of the problem and let them come up with some innovative solutions. We might come up with things that we've never thought of.
Do you see that as a multi-campus grants program, as a multidisciplinary grants program? Do you see a stakeholder engagement in participatory research in that grants program, Jay? All the above. Thoughts on what it would look like?
Yeah, all
the above. Okay, all right. Jay?
I hate to come back to it again, but I would encourage them to produce a lot of little bets. When I push my students on innovation, that's the one thing I want to get across from them. And it's based on some excellent research out of Stanford University where entrepreneurs and innovators think differently than most folks do, the people that are very successful in innovation. You can just imagine going to a meeting, and usually a manager will say, I'm going to put resources here and we're going to have some success in this area. That's the way most of it here, most of things happen around here. But it turns out that innovators and entrepreneurs think differently. They think, I have a little bit of resources and I'm willing to give them up. I'm going to throw them away in a little bet. I don't plan on gaining anything, but I'm going to look for small wins out of this. And this produces this mixing. So there's a humility involved. There's an acknowledgement that I don't know where the wins will be, but I'm going to try a lot of different things, and I know that I'll come up with wins in this way. And I know Ronnie and JB both, and neither one of them are smart enough to figure out where the wins will be. So I would encourage them to embrace this approach in taking many, many small gambles.
Hopefully they'll be in the Big Ten. Fred?
Well, again, I would say that, you know, if it's just one thing, I think we have to try to build a global mindset in our young people, and a global mindset in this institute, a global mindset in this state. Even though we're sitting here in the middle of the U.S., we still have to understand that the future is global. And that means that we have to have a global mindset. That means that we don't have to move abroad. It would be helpful to, send students abroad, because why? That's where they get that, feeling of new ideas, new diversity kinds of ways of doing things. We just, I think, have to do more of that, and that's where the future is. And we know that to be true, but we have to get that mindset going. I personally have, coursework that we've developed that can do that. We can't change personalities, we can't change how we look, but we can change, again, our confidence. We can change our level of hope. We can change our level of resiliency. We can change our level of optimism. And I personally got that from not social psychology, but clinical psychology, because they're doing that already in a lot of their client work. So we're taking that to the workplace, we're taking that to the educational domain of building those so-called soft skills in our kids. And that means more than the basics. It means changing the mindset, which can be done. And we've shown it empirically.
Great start, and we have three really, really highly successful social entrepreneurs. Let's open it to the audience. Questions, and there are microphones around the room.
Everybody else is shy?
Please.
Hi, I'm Allard Braungord. I'm at the University of Notre Dame. I'm at something called the Institute for Latino Studies. And I think the question that I would have for the panel is one that I think we not fundamentally touched. I agree with Professor Luthen's. I think being positive is important. I speak about migration a lot, so you can imagine that that's giving that twist is interesting. But one of the issues that we really haven't talked about is the transformation of higher education in order to accomplish some of these goals. Higher education remains extremely traditional. We are still locked in the state of knowledge of the 19th century in our departments. And as someone who's at an institute, one of the points I'm continuously trying to make is departments are nouns, they're about something. Institutes are about themes, they're verbs. They're about getting something done. They're about moving the highest level of academic research into some practical way that we can use, into some way that the university can, in effect, help society to solve some of the problems at a time when society is undergoing an incredible rate of change. And yet, none of the incentive structures of the university really recognize this. It's okay, it's good to have recognition, and it's good to have some money for grants, but does it really help promotions? And does it really help the next generation of scholars who are going to be working in a truly interdisciplinary way? In a previous conversation, I was talking to somebody, and the question about interdisciplinarity, and I'm always struck about when a sociologist says, well, I'm working with an anthropologist, and that's interdisciplinary. That's not really interdisciplinary. You're still talking with somebody in social scientists. Get a theologian talking with a lawyer, and get them talking with a business person, and get them talking to an engineer. That's interdisciplinary. And so the question for me, for you, would be, you have an administration that is seemingly behind this effort, not only across campus, but across several campuses, across all disciplines, across several campuses, across the state. How would you work with the senior administration, but also with the powers that be, the traditional powers that be within the university, to change the incentive structure, to change rewards, and to make sure that this behavior and these activities are something that are going to be rewarded into the future, and in fact can lead the way to perhaps the way that higher education needs to be transformed for future generations.
That will also be our next conference starting in 15 minutes. But truly the key question. Gentlemen, I've been skirting it a bit with you, and I do think the audience would really like to weigh in a bit. Is it a separate faculty line? Is it a separate sort of continuous employment? Is it a separate revenue stream? Does it link to the private sector or the stakeholder communities in new ways that assure continuous faculty improvement and employment and reward? Thoughts?
So I think there was something really interesting about your question and your comment, and that is there's always a tension, particularly in areas like engineering. So I teach in a chemical engineering department, and it's a discipline that the coursework is so structured that there's little alternative for the student, little time for the students to take classes outside the discipline because they have to get all that coursework in. And yet, you know, we talk about interdisciplinarity and working in teams, but yet when you work in teams, you still have specialists on the teams. And so the tension here is you want to have a student come out of a program and really understand an area so that they can go out into the workforce and actually do something and contribute. If you have a discipline that is so interdisciplinary, they'll just skim across the top and won't get deep into that discipline. So, you know, I think there's still a very important role for our traditional academic departments, in that is getting people deep into a discipline. You know, I think though what we have to build on top of that is a way for them to interact with others, and part of that's through taking all the other courses that they might take outside the discipline, but it's also introducing them to problems that require an interdisciplinary approach. And so I think there's an important tension here, but I think traditional departments are still a very important part of the university education.
Okay. Shane, thoughts on this one?
Well, your question was about incentives, and I don't know too much about that. I do believe you get what you reward, but it's just not something I do a lot. I find that the students I work with, they're either there just to get a degree and get out, or they're there to do something really good. And the ones that want to do something good are self-motivated and can do amazing things. Rather than incentives, I'm very interested in the structure, the environment that they're placed in. So I think you can build one building that will produce 5 Nobel laureates, and you can put the same people in another building and they'll all just hate each other and nothing will happen. And I think it's really about the environment that's created. There's environments that promote this mixing of ideas and this diversity, and I think we need to really look more at the environment that they exist in. We heard about Florence in 1500, you know, 400 BC in Greece, Silicon Valley today. There are these special environments that produce wonderful things, and that's really what I'm interested in, is producing those right environments. I think those environments can exist in Ravenna, Nebraska, if we frame them properly.
Fred, thoughts?
Well, I think, again, it's what we'd call units of analysis, meaning I think we have to start at the individual level in educating, you know, realistic education, and that's where they get some of the, you know, specializations that they obviously are interested in. But then we have to force them, even in the pedagogy, into teams. And of course, we do a lot of that to the chagrin of a lot of good students, because, you know, they'll, you know, complain, I do all the work and everybody gets the credit. And but they have to start working in teams, because if we want them to work in teams when they get out and work in, you know, at a team level, then we have to start in the pedagogy of our coursework that we do. And I think we're doing a lot better at that than we did 10, 15 years ago, for sure. And now it's just kind of the accepted way that classes are run. And, you know, I still run a big lecture hall, and wow, I don't get the teaching ratings I used to get, because they're just not expecting that anymore. In China, no problem. But so I think it's you know, go to the team level. Then we have to go to the organizational level. Then we have to go to the community level. Then we have to go to the, you know, bigger even than that, the societal level. But how do we get there? I think we have to do that through the way that we're structuring things, incentivizing things. And if we want to get, you know, teamwork, we have to reward teamwork. And if we want communities to get together, we have to reward communities to get together. And ways to do that is that I think that at the community level, it's not so much legislating things to happen, but I think it's we have to, incentivize, not by money again, the city leaders. That's who's going to make a difference. That's who's creating jobs across the country. That's the communities that I know about are the people who want to give back. And those are usually the people who are in all of our small communities. We know who they are, and they've got to get going and get the leadership behind this, not necessarily just our elected officials.
Other questions? Please, Bill?
My question goes to sort of the institutional level of universities, because I think that when we're thinking about the rural futures, we're thinking about it in that context. And my concern is that a lot of the incentives, a lot of the reasons why people are doing what they're doing and why we applaud this innovation and not that innovation has to do with the kind of institutional context in which universities are operating. So my question has to do with what are your estimates? I'm going to take Chuck's point here about looking in the future. What are your estimates? I've talked too long, so they cut me off.
We're listening, Bill, don't worry.
What are your estimates of where the money will be in 10, 20, 30 years? For example, if the Rural Futures Institute is thinking about positioning itself, where are the grants going to come from? The other incentive that you've mentioned is jobs. Typically in university, jobs are not considered a high identified incentive on people's careers. When I'm sitting in committees judging people's careers, it doesn't make a big difference whether they've created a lot of jobs or not. It's about papers, it's about the research grants, and so on. So that's the context in which the universities have to operate. What will that context look like in 10, 20 years, and what implications does it have for Rural Futures Institute in positioning itself for that kind of an environment?
Let me add an addendum, if I might, Bill, to your question, which arose last night. Some of you could not be here. I thought one of the salient moments was the young woman in the middle of the panel that basically paused a minute in response to her question and said, "This is why I believe the University of Nebraska can make a huge difference." And it goes to everything hinges on the tip of intentionality. And what she was saying is the 4 platforms you have, Ronnie, represent a diversity of needs that will have to occur for those incentives to move eventually at a university setting. And here's a young woman just finishing a matriculation in the university, recognizing an unrealized potential that could exist for cultural change. So to Bill's question, thoughts from the panel about how we do this in a rural landscape, and we have skirted the stakeholder question a good little bit so far in this discussion. And as an Aggie by training and by family, it's very, very clear to me that mainline agriculture, and to the point of where we go with biomass, has had a huge impact over time in sustaining the agricultural research, outreach, and teaching of our universities. And to your point, you know, the reality is there are communities out here now that could align in new and exciting ways with this institute. There are firms that need those engineers and need those biochemists. Thoughts about all that to Bill's question. Is there a new model? Can we think about new collaborations in creating a future, not responding? Thoughts?
Do I always have to go first?
Don't have to. This organizational management guy's pretty cool. He waits till you're done and then he comes in and sums it up.
Exactly, with the smart comments. I'll let you start.
Well, I would say, again, some pragmatic things to try to get at that would be this whole, again, fairly recent emphasis on internships. I know that we have the opportunity in the smaller communities in Nebraska that are dying for some interns. And it's a matter of hooking that up, but I think I know our students would love to do that, especially for a summer or something like that, and we can therefore build some experience and give them an opportunity to really get their feet wet, and it's a win-win. So I love the fact that, you know, even at the state government level again, that they're incentivizing internships. I believe there's matching money for that here in Nebraska. And I think that this is an opportunity that we can really take hold of as kind of a one solution that gets people, and then when we get them out there, wow, this is a pretty cool place. I really like the community that I'm in and so forth. So in other words, I think that's one very pragmatic thing that I can think of, you know, very quickly here.
Shane? Jay?
Yeah, you know, the question was again about incentives, and I'll go back to what I said before about the environment is really the important thing. If you have an environment where internships are easy, that's where you're going to go out in your education and you're going to learn about problems that don't have only one answer and those sorts of things. If you were giving a lot of seed grants, you have then an environment where people are willing to team up, let's try something, let's see if it'll work, that kind of attitude. So I think universities really need to focus on fostering that innovative environment. And when I say innovative, I always mean, you know, the diversity term and the multidisciplinary term in my mind are really the same thing. And even to make a further definition, when I say innovative, I always mean it has to be different is the first thing, and it has to be good is the second thing. Your first point is, if you're doing something that everybody else is doing, it's not different, so therefore it's not innovative. If you're doing something that's not working and not good, then also I would say it's also not innovative. So pay attention, do things that are different and that are good.
I think that leaders can change the incentive structure. I think that's an important thing for a leader to do, and I think you can even do it in academic institutions. As someone said, they're very traditional, and they have these traditional ways of reviewing people, but over time that could change. I think it's hard to evaluate, say, university professors on jobs created because those tend to come long after the real innovation took place, but you can do things like look at interdisciplinary publications. You can do things like look at patents filed, patents licensed. You can still review them on publications and teaching and all of those kinds of things, but you can add on top of that something special. And so I think there's a way that leaders in the academic community can change the incentives over time, and that will have a big impact on at least the educational field.
Okay. Question, please.
Hi, my name is Cecil Steward. I am Dean Emeritus of the College of Architecture at the University of Nebraska and founder of an institute which we call the Joslin Institute for Sustainable Communities. I'll phrase my question first and then give just a second of background comment. Two questions. How do we create real partnership between the university and communities of this state? Real, interactive, working partnership. Secondly, how do we avoid another silo effect between rural and urban? We will not succeed by focusing either on the cities or exclusively on rural issues and opportunity. I very much agree with Dr. Lujan's points of view about a global attitude. This is where our future will be determined. Not state, not national, not regional, not international, but global. Our problems are imperative, and I think we have plenty of evidence to see that the community is where the rubber hits the road, and it's where our survival and our opportunities will exist.
Okay. Thank
so
you.
These are two questions I think, as we move along, need to be carried with us.
And the two questions are, what are real, lasting, sustainable, functional relationships between the communities in Nebraska and the university? How do we encourage them in a transdisciplinary manner? And how about the rural-urban continuum and the impact one has on one another in a new world of ideas? Thoughts?
Well, I would start with mutual respect. I think, again, that we have to have mutual respect across the university to the community, from the rural to the urban, and then, of course, the pragmatic part of all that. How do we have that happen? And I think one way we can do that in Nebraska, at least, is because we're small enough still that we can have that mutual respect. I'll tell you what I talk about when I go out to the world, or when I go out to, University of Michigan to give a talk or wherever. I talk about the North Platte Canteen. People love that story. I'm assuming most of you or all of you know about that. But I love the Nebraska Canteen story, where they served, out of their hide during World War II, something like several million soldiers coming through North Platte, Nebraska at the Nebraska Canteen. I love that story, and I, of course, go into the details of it, but everybody talks about that. Everybody thinks that that really is a selling point. We're building from our strengths here in Nebraska, and that is, again, that we have this kind of mutual respect with our rural roots. And I think that that then goes both ways. I think people in Omaha feel the same way. I'm proud of Omaha. I'm proud of Lincoln. I'm proud of North Platte. I'm proud of the farm out in western Nebraska. So I think, how do we get that mutual respect? We have to build from our strengths, which here in Nebraska I think is pretty darn strong to begin with.
Okay, Shane, Jay?
Well, I'm just sitting here thinking about my perception of the university system when I was a young man in Ravenna, and what my parents' perception of it was. And there was really a couple things that I saw. One was the medical center was the place you went when you were really sick, so it had a direct connection to a lot of Nebraska families in that way. And the second was, well, your older brother goes to college, he goes to Lincoln. I had two older brothers that did that. But it was, I think it was seen as sort of a stepping stone. You went to Lincoln and then you went off somewhere else. And I think that there's a narrow view of what the university does in the local communities, and I would probably blame the university rather than the local communities for this. I think the university needs to do more in terms of changing that perception. So I think of the summer math programs that are so good here at UNL. I think that's an excellent way to go out and impacting the internships. If we can send students back to these communities that bring the message of the university back in a deep way into the community, not just in a superficial way. I would point to programs like that as things that we need to really look at hard.
Jay?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think it's not just the educational side, it's also the research side. Being on a farm in Nebraska, I never knew what research was about until actually I got to the university and got involved with it as an undergraduate. And I think most people don't realize how important that is for, just from a practical point of view. And one thing that we do, I shouldn't say, in Berkeley, we have the same problem, even with the local community in Berkeley, California, where they don't necessarily understand what's going on in the research community at the university. And so we have these outreach programs where we bring people in and talk about important problems of the day and what we're doing to try to solve those problems. And I think those can do a lot for the community, understanding what the university is about and why you have a university, and that it's not just about education, why you have research at a university. So the challenge, though, is that you've got to take it to them. You can't expect them to come into Lincoln to hear that.
Yeah, the question I always get is, you only teach one class last semester, right?
Exactly.
What do you do the rest of your time, that kind of thing?
I actually knew it all started, these problems, at Berkeley. But I do want to remind you of Bob Barty's comment last night, which I knew very well when Dr. Keith Muir, heads our health panel, was at the medical center. And that program could be replicated in every discipline in the university, looking for young rural students, bringing them in, staying with them, trying to guide them, doing it in a community context where there's community outreach for the university. That's what extension is about. So they're wonderful models, as the math model is. We're going to have time for maybe one or two more questions. Dan, please.
Yeah, my name is Dan Lichter. I'm a professor and demographer at Cornell University, but I grew up just north of here in South Dakota, in Mitchell, and so I have ties to the Great Plains. My question is really a question about the future and pipeline issues. We've talked about the population today in Nebraska and around the Great Plains, but half of all births today in the United States are to groups other than non-Hispanic white. The professoriate is going to retire. The median age in this group is probably 58.2, and it's overwhelmingly white. Yet 20 years from now, we're going to have a population where the elderly have retired or died off, and we've got a young generation of disadvantaged groups, primarily Hispanics and historically disadvantaged black populations that have to fill the vacuum. And so I'm wondering, what can the university do in a very practical way to help these pipeline issues? And they're not going to go away. The Census Bureau, as I said, is projected by the year 2042, we're going to be a majority-minority society. So if we talk about the future of the Great Plains or Nebraska, it seems to me that we have to embrace diversity, and that's why I found this morning's talk especially insightful and challenging for all of us.
I knew this would happen with this great panel. We now have a lot of questions, so I'm going to ask if you could go quickly, and we'll try to get to 2 or 3 more. Thanks, Dan. Reaction to Dan's question.
You know, I think it's not just about diversity of skin color, it's also economic diversity as well. We have a program that we run in Berkeley where we bring in students from families who are the first generation to go to college, these students, and try to get them into college and help them write their essays for college and interest them in science and research, because we have such a problem with our pipeline in science in that it's largely white males, and we have to change that dramatically, and many ways to do that.
Shane?
Yeah, I'll twist it a little bit just based on my own experience. One of our problems that I always saw was that we didn't have enough locals doing graduate work. We had a lot of local Nebraska kids who would come get an undergraduate degree, but none of them would get a master's or a PhD. And we had to import PhD students from India and China primarily were the two sources. But I think it's because they weren't asked. I think our local students just simply weren't encouraged and asked to continue on, say, hey, you're good. You could be good at any school in the country. You can go to MIT or Stanford or wherever you want. But why don't you think about a master's or a PhD? And I think we need to do more.
Fred, quickly, I want to try to get 3 more questions.
I just think it's a realistic problem for the future, and we have to do everything in terms of this innovation around that as well.
Okay, thanks, Fred. Joe, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Fluharty. I guess I want to kind of lead the witnesses a bit here by just suggesting some intersections that came together for me in this publication I'm holding. I'm Joe Sertich, President Emeritus of the Northeast Minnesota Higher Education District. And 2 things. One is, this is one of few reverse publication papers in the country where you actually get the news from the communities and then they turn around and publish it once a week. A bit of innovation that for the most part started with community colleges. The other featured in this is an Iron Range engineering program, very innovative, where it's project-based, project-centered. And so in it, small utility is giving a $125,000 grant to a program that's only producing 14 engineers right now, but has already received 3 or 4 awards. My point, or my question, I guess. We look for collaboration. What about the 868 place-based institutions called community colleges? We have 5 of them here, I understand, in Nebraska with several campuses in those 5 systems. I happen to know 2 of those presidents well. What about the collaboration there that could actually do the community development that leads to economic growth on the ground, in the dirt, around the communities, and leverage those relationships as a way to really promote collaboration?
Thanks, Joe. 2 minutes on answer, and we'll get 2 more questions, then we need to stop.
Again, I think you're right on. I think that's, again, part of the future. We have to get to the community college level, I think, not only as feeders into our programs, but as an end in itself, as a collaborative, institution. I think that, my example is Kalamazoo, Michigan. Kalamazoo has the city leaders, not the elected officials, get together and create what they call the Kalamazoo Promise. That any kid who graduates from Kalamazoo High School, no grade point average or anything else, is guaranteed to go to either the community college or Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. That's a wonderful program. And I think it's, again, gives everybody the opportunity to get involved at the grassroots level. That community got together to do that.
Thanks, Fred. Other comments?
No, I'll just
Okay.
rubber stamp.
Okay. Next up, please, okay, sorry. We have 3, and then we'll stop.
Thank you. My name is Denise Farley. I'm on the Lancaster County Extension Board here in Lincoln. And I am a citizen of Lincoln, and I have also been raised in western Nebraska and have farm interests out there. So I spent many years going home to farm in the summer, and I still have a great interest in seeing rural Nebraska grow. 2 questions. Does the university have a role at a much earlier age getting kids to understand their strengths and, in a sense, grooming them for their careers? Could we encourage communities to have a big community service push so that they can get in the hospitals, they can get in nursing homes, they can get in the bank to do job shadowings at an early age so that they can kind of have a focus of this is what this job is about. Do we have, we could have citizen advisory boards or youth advisory boards where they talk to the school board, they talk to the mayor, they talk to the library, they talk to the city council. Encourage those youth leaders at a much earlier age. Do we have a function in that?
And if you'd ask your question as well.
Well, do we have a function in that at an earlier age? And then also, do you see an opportunity for universities to exchange students, not just abroad, because abroad is a great experience, but how about state to state?
Okay.
So that they could go away and come back. Can we do that?
As quickly as we can, it's a great question. I'm
I
sorry
would
to
just
run
say
out of time.
also from city to rural, rural to city.
Okay.
Exchanges.
Okay. Others?
I had a friend who, my history was in space robotics. That's where I started doing my work. And he said that we should justify NASA's budget only on its inspirational value, that people always go out and try to make a case that we're going to learn about science and we're going to learn about the origins of the universe. Well, nobody cared about that stuff. But you should fund NASA only on the idea that it's going to get rockets on TV and it's going to get astronauts and engineers on TV. Now, you can agree or disagree, but I think that's that can be a big role for the university for earlier ages, is to get cool stuff in front of young people.
We have 2 great Nebraskans still standing, and I'm going to ask them to ask their question together. First is Maxine Maw, who many of you may know was prior lieutenant governor, founded the Nebraska Community Foundation, and we're now honored to have her serve as the Rural Development Director in Nebraska, and Chuck Schroeder, who obviously was president of the Foundation for the University, was president of the National Cattlemen's Association, and is now president and CEO of the Cowboy Museum in Oklahoma City. Would you ask your questions, and we'll try to combine them for the panel. Really sorry we're running short. Maxine?
Thank you very much, Chuck. I would make it more of a challenge than a question, and interdisciplinary one as well. And that is, I challenge you to look at what's happening in the university system today, the community college system, the innovation that's already going on, and how you can bring that to scale. And in this book on our tables is a short piece about business builders in Curtis, Nebraska, at your own College of Technical Agriculture. That needs to be brought to scale. It is addressing some of the things that many people have already talked about and how you mentor young people and get them to consider going back home. And I also challenge you to make this a long-term commitment. It takes many, many years to make a real impact in your communities. Nebraska Community Foundation is an example, 20 years almost of service to the state, and it is finally getting to scale, and it is growing rapidly.
Thanks, Maxine. Chuck.
Chuck, thank you. Number one, let me just say this has been a terrific panel, and I only want to highlight two comments that were made coincidental to the conversation up here that I want to make sure are not dropped to the cutting room floor. Fred made a wonderful statement about education going to the individual level and understanding a student's interests, strengths, proclivities, the opportunities that might flow to those things, but looking at a student on an individual level. Jay's comment about leadership. We've talked all morning about structures and incentives, institutional structures. The fact is, structure and incentives will follow leadership. If you want to see a narrow-minded, sod-bound institution, I don't care what the structures are, put people of that nature in leadership roles. We know a lot about individual strengths and talents today and how to measure those. Putting people in leadership roles who will model multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary work, who will model collaboration, who will model innovation, will drive structures and incentives. And I might just say that hiring Ronnie Green was not a bad idea in that regard. So anyway.
Let me close. We have 1 minute left. Two great comments that I think align phenomenally. And would you incorporate that into any final comments? We're very tight for time. You've been a tremendous panel. Final thoughts on these issues.
Let's be positive. Let's remember we are better than any one of us, and that's what I want to close with.
Okay.
Yeah, go read The Magic of Thinking Big. That's a good one. Think positive.
It is indeed. Jay?
I think I can't say anything better than those two.
A tremendous panel of really, really marvelous Nebraska natives. Let's express our appreciation.